You know, I love to start every sermon off with a good question. My question for you this morning is this, and maybe you don't need to raise your hand, answer it internally, because I'm not trying to start any family problems, but how many of you love your mother-in-law? Me, okay. Some of you love your mother-in-law, and I know sometimes that can be a very tense relationship. It can be a tense relationship. I have a good mother-in-law, and I'm not just saying that because she goes here. I really do mean it. She is awesome. She's in the elementary room today teaching the kids. But I can honestly say I have such a great mother-in-law. I'm so blessed. And today, we're continuing our series from the line of David by looking at another person in Jesus' family tree. And this woman's name was Ruth. Ruth was not a Jew. She was a Moabite. And if you've read through the Old Testament, you know, typically Moabites are like the bad people. They are not usually people who God is trying to use or to bless. They are typically the enemies of the Israelites. And after Ruth's husband dies, she gives up everything to move to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. And maybe at first glance, this doesn't seem really strange to you. You're like, well, maybe they had a great relationship. They were best friends, and she chose to go and do that. But in this time period, that would have been a very weird thing to do. For Ruth, she was young. She was a widow. She didn't really have a way to be able to provide for herself in society, and there were laws that would take care of widows, but really her best option to be able to make it in life would have been to try to get remarried. But instead, she does something really crazy, and she chooses to go back with her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, to a place where she is not from, where she does not know anyone, to a place where she might not be welcomed because of who she is. And her mother-in-law, Naomi, tells her that she has her blessing. She's like, go back to your people. It's totally fine. I'm going to be fine. But this is what Ruth says in chapter 1, verse 16. She says, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. And I feel like it's important to note here that they have just gone through an incredible family tragedy. Not only has Ruth's husband passed away, but Naomi's husband also passed away, and her other son. So she has these two daughter-in-laws, and they're all just left as widows. And so she tells both daughter-in-laws, look, the best thing you can do is to go back to your family. But Ruth was determined to stay. The other one does go, and that was fine. But Ruth was determined to stay. She was determined to stay. And so the natural question as I read this story is why? Why would you do that? Why would you choose the path that doesn't seem to make sense? Why would you choose to be faithful to a situation that probably will not lead to the best outcome for you? And this is truly what is so powerful about this story. You know, today we're talking about Ruth because Ruth is the one who is mentioned in the line of David. But this story is just as much about Naomi and who Naomi was and the mother-in-law who she was to Ruth. You see, there was something about Naomi. There had to have been something about her. Something about the way that she treated Ruth, something about the way that she talked about her God. She had a genuine relationship with God, which then spilled over into Ruth's life. She saw who God was. And understand, too, that Ruth, as a Moabite, would have grown up not learning about the true God. She wouldn't have known about him. She would have known about many false gods. But she saw something different here with Naomi. And in the 10 years that she was a part of Naomi's family, she had really seen who God was. She had experienced his love through her mother-in-law. So much so that she was willing to go wherever she was going, to become a people with someone who she didn't know, and to serve a God who was not the God she had grown up serving. And so the first question I think for all of us this morning is, who are you called to be a Naomi to? Maybe it is someone in your family, maybe it's one of your in-laws, maybe they are a difficult in-law, but you are called to be a Naomi to them. You are called to show them God's love, to show them who he is. Maybe it's a coworker. And I think it's important in a lot of these situations to understand, we don't know what their relationship was like at the beginning. It probably was maybe not very great. And so sometimes the people in your life who you are called to be a Naomi to may not be the people who you get along with really easily. They may not be the people who you click with really well. It might be someone who you're going to have to work hard, maybe over a period of 10 years like they did, to really become family. to become united as the family of God. When I think of a Naomi, Naomi is somebody who you could always call. They would show up for you, whatever you needed. You could call them and ask them to go out to coffee. They're the person who shows up at your door with food or with something that you need on a tough week. Maybe it's a coworker and they're always willing to help you with a work project when you get in over your head. And it's really easy to be that kind of person to people who reciprocate it, to people who are grateful for it, but it's much harder to be that kind of person to someone who is maybe far from God. They've never experienced his love. Maybe they've had a bad experience in the church and they have a hard time believing what you say, believing that your love is genuine, believing that God's love is genuine. And for me, and I know I've shared this story maybe before, but I had a youth leader growing up who really changed my life. She changed my life, and I'm thankful I grew up in a great home with parents who showed me God's love. I grew up in the church surrounded by people who showed me God's love, but she is one who always sticks out in my mind as someone who was outside of my family, who took the time to just notice me. And her name was Tracy, and Tracy was my 8th grade life group leader. And as many of you know, middle school is a really tough time. It's a tough time. It is not great. It is the most awkward time. And we had an 8th grade group of just girls, just all girls. And she was our only leader. And I just can remember coming into life group time, much like we do on a Wednesday night. And it's very similar. You come into the room and you're trying to get them to talk through the discussion questions. And we're just all talking about our weekly drama and our little stuff. And she would just sit there though, and she would never get frustrated with us. She would just listen to us. She would laugh with us. And she just made us feel really loved. But for Tracy, it went so much beyond just what we would do at church. She would have us to her house. She even trusted me to babysit her children, which did not go very well. I was not a good babysitter as a teenager. I've come a long way. But I got locked out of the house one time. I burnt mac and cheese another time. I ruined their vacuum one time. It was not good for them that I babysat their children. And I'm sure you're wondering, how is it possible that you can do all those things? Somehow I did. It was just not good. But she invited me into her life and into the life of her family. She trusted me with her children, and I can just remember sitting at the counter in her home and just spilling my heart to her and knowing that she was never going to judge me. She was never going to belittle me for any doubts or problems that I had. She just was always there to listen. And she was the reason why I wound up in youth ministry, because I wanted to be able to give some kids what she had given to me. She was someone who most people would look at and see as just a normal person. But she changed my life. And I think it's the same with Naomi too. Naomi is this just super normal person. But her genuine love for God that turned into genuine love for other people changed the trajectory of Ruth's life. It changed her life. And that kind of love, it alters our eternities. It alters our destinies. It alters the course that we're on because it shows us the better way. And that kind of love, it led Ruth to choose loyalty to God and to Naomi over what was convenient and over what made sense. She chose to remain loyal and faithful to the people who had been faithful to her. And it did not make sense that this was what she was going to do. But she knew that if she stayed with Ruth, if she stayed with Naomi, that she was loved. She knew that God was going to protect her and he was going to be with her and that there was something pulling her to go with Naomi. And I think it's the same in our lives. The kind of faithfulness that God calls us to, it does not always make sense. It doesn't make sense. Sometimes God asks us to stick it out in a job, in a relationship, or in a tough situation. And there are many times where God does release us and he asks us to walk away, but there's a lot of times where he asks us to remain faithful, not to make our own plans, not to start over, but to stay. And faithfulness, I think it's one of the hardest fruits of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22, there's all the list of the things that if the Spirit is evident in our life that should be coming out of us. But faithfulness is hard, and it's hard when people mistreat you. It's hard when the situations just feel unending. We all want to be faithful until it starts costing us, until it gets too hard, until it seems too bad. But here's the thing I want you to hear this morning above anything else. When we are faithful to God, he is faithful to us. When we are faithful to him, he is faithful to us, because faithful is who he is. It's the story of the whole Bible. You know, sometimes I think God gets a bad rap, and in the Old Testament, we don't see God as being like gracious and faithful and loving. He's always just like coming down on them. And then Jesus shows up, and all of a sudden he is. But really, God was faithful and compassionate and loving the whole time, because it's his character, and his character doesn't change. In Exodus 34:6, it says, I am the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. And then in John 1:17, it tells us that the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came in its fullness through Jesus Christ. God always, 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 always has a plan. Always. Even when you cannot see it, even when you cannot understand it, even when you are tired of it, he has a plan. He is always working, and he is doing everything he possibly can behind the scenes to prepare us and to provide for us. This is the story of the Bible. And even in the beginning, in Genesis, when Adam and Eve, they royally mess everything up. 7 verses after they sin and they bring sin into the world, God's like, it's okay, I already had a plan. I already had a plan. I had it covered. I had you covered. And even when we mess up, even when we don't remain faithful, even when we miss the mark, God is faithful to us, and he extends his grace to us. He does not expect us to be perfect, but what he does want is for us to just keep trusting and keep walking, to keep going where we feel he is leading us. And for Ruth, she did not know what was going to happen. It's much like, you know, the story of Abraham. I think we all admire the story of Abraham. You know, God just tells him, he's like, go and I'll tell you when to stop. And he just does. He leaves his family, he leaves everything, and he just starts walking. And we look at that and we're like, that's so cool. I would do that too. But we all find ourselves in those moments where God is like calling us out, and it's like, man, this is really uncomfortable. When do I get to stop? When is this going to be over? It's hard to trust God and to remain faithful in the uncertain seasons. And so Ruth, she goes with Naomi, and they move back to Bethlehem, and she begins just working in the fields, because that's what, you know, they were going to need to do to provide for themselves. And she works so hard. She was like, this is the thing, I'm like, man, Ruth was faithful, and she was a hard worker. She worked so hard that the owner of the field, he notices this, and he's like, who is this girl? Why is she working so hard? What is going on? Everyone else would stop and take breaks, and she would just keep working, because it was important to her that she took care of her mother-in-law, that she worked hard to provide for them. And the owner of that particular field, his name was Boaz, and he was actually a relative of Naomi's husband. And this is where the story really starts to get good. It really starts to get good because Boaz, just like Naomi, he loved the Lord. He loved the Lord, and he was a good man with a good heart who wanted to serve the Lord and to take care of the people who were working his fields. And he did a lot of things that most people during that time period really wouldn't have done. He goes out of his way to take care of his workers, and specifically to take care of Ruth, to make sure that she had water, to make sure that she had snacks. How many of you love the people who they just show up with like coffee and snacks for you? And he did. He took care of his workers. He showed up for them and made sure that they had food to take home. And Ruth was just like completely overwhelmed by this because, again, she's not used to being treated like this. She's not used to being treated well, to having someone notice her and take care of her. And so in chapter 2, you know, she doesn't know what to do. And so she goes to Boaz and she thanks him and she says, "What have I done to deserve such kindness? I am only a foreigner." Now this is where the story really, really gets good. Because what you have to understand is that Boaz was the son of Rahab. Rahab, you may remember, is the former prostitute of Jericho who God uses to help the spies who he sent. In Matthew chapter 1, you would have seen it on the screen. It says Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And Rahab was someone who, just like Ruth, had not grown up knowing about the Lord. She grew up in a place where he was not worshiped, he was not talked about, people did not know him. But she had heard about him. She had heard about him and about what he was doing. And from what she had heard, she knew he was real. She knew that he was real. She knew that there was something different about him. And her faith in this God who she had never really even met causes her to risk everything to help these spies who God sent to her. And God sends them specifically to her, to the person who was probably least likely to be used in this situation. She risks her family's safety to help them escape. And then when the Israelites come and they take Jericho, her and her family were protected. And God was faithful to her because she was faithful to him. And so her and her family, they got to join the Israelites in the promised land. They got to start over. She got to leave her life behind. And so for Boaz, he knew what it was like to be a foreigner in a strange land. He probably knew what it was like to have a mom who had to make tough choices in order to provide for her family. He saw the choices that his mother made, and he had compassion for Ruth. He had compassion for her because he knew what it was like. And his life experiences, though they probably, weren't great to maybe walk through at different points, were what prepared him for this moment to respond with kindness and compassion to Ruth. And in verse 11, Boaz, this is his response to her. He says, "Yes, I know, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done." You see, God was Boaz's refuge. He knew that. He knew that God loved him and God was providing for him. And so he knew that his job was to be that for every other person in his life. And he extends this to Ruth, no questions asked. Now the story gets really, really, really good. Because Naomi, she realizes that Boaz is someone who is like a part of their family. And so there was this way that people could be provided for after they had been widowed, and it was called a Kinsmen Redeemer. And a Kinsmen Redeemer was a male in your family who would be able to then marry you and to carry on your family line to help take over the estate. And Naomi, as any good mother-in-law does, she makes a plan. She schemes a little bit. She has good reasons for it. And she tells Ruth, she's like, "Look, you're going to go approach him. You're going to be like, hey, seems like we kind of like each other, and you are our family's potential kinsman redeemer. Would you consider it?" And Boaz, he does, and there was someone else who was actually next in line, and he goes to him first, and he takes care of all of this. And Naomi was confident that he would. She said, "Boaz will not rest until he sees this all through." And so they marry, and long story short, they end up having a son. And in Ruth chapter 4, the women of the town, they come to Naomi, and they say, "Praise the Lord who has provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age. For he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons." And if we keep reading in the genealogy, we see that Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. God always has a plan. And Ruth, if she would have gone back to her family, would have never been a part of this story. The story and the line of David would have been very different. But God had everything set up. Even how he sets everything up through Rahab is just like genius. Do you ever have moments like that? You can just look back on your life and be like, "Wow, God, in the moment that all felt so bad, but now I can see what you were doing. I can see how you were working. I can see how you were being faithful, and you were setting this all up." And it's our job to just be faithful to him and to be faithful to the people around us, to keep loving them with everything that we have. And you never know whose life you might be changing by just loving them, by just being there for them, by just showing up for them, by telling them about who God is, and by showing them who he is by how you treat them. And this is kind of our theme for this whole series as we look at different people in the line of David. God is in the business of using flawed people, flawed circumstances to fulfill his purposes. He uses the most messed up situations to bring hope and healing to people. And we might not always know why we have to endure the things we have to endure, why things pan out the way that they do, but we can trust that God always has a plan. He always has a plan. He is always working. And when we know that God is faithful, we don't have to know anything else. And I know that's a really hard statement, because if you're like me, you want to have everything figured out. You want to know what every next step is. You want to know what the plan is. I want to know if I'm investing time in something that it's going to work out the way that I think it should. But the longer I've walked with Jesus, the more I've had to just get comfortable with not knowing. And as long as I know who he is, that's all I need to know. As long as I know that he is good and he is faithful and he is true and he's going to protect me and he has my good in mind, that's it. That's it. And so like Ruth and Naomi, like Abraham, like all these people throughout the Bible, when he says go, I'm just going to keep going. When he says stay, I'm just going to stay. You know, I love how he led the Israelites through their time in the wilderness. He led them really directly. And in the daytime, there would be this pillar of like smoke, like a cloud. And they would just like follow it. When it stopped, they would stop. And at night, there was always a pillar of fire. And when it moved, they would move. And when it stopped, they would stop. And I want my life to be like that I know God so well and I can see him so clearly in my everyday life that I just follow, that I just do my best to stay faithful. You know, when Josh and I, when we moved back to Kansas 9 years ago, it was like a really crazy situation, and we were still in college, but we really felt like we were supposed to be here because we wanted to be at Mission Hill. We wanted to be at Mission Hill, and we just hated being in Florida. I'm sorry to those of you who love Florida. It was not a fun place for us to live. There's alligators everywhere. My hair looked terrible all the time because of the humidity. It was just bad. It was not a good time. Fun to vacation. Didn't like living there. But when we moved back and we had to pay our tuition and we paid our rent and we did all these different things. And I remember we had like $10 in our bank account. We had $10, and that's like the worst feeling in the world. But I knew, even in that moment where it felt like, wow, we have given up everything to come back, and I don't really know if this was the right thing to do. I knew it was what God was asking us to do. I just knew it. I knew it. And so there was a lot of fear and there was a lot of uncertainty. And over the last 9 years, it has been costly to stay faithful to Jesus, but it's been so worth it. It's been so worth it. Because in my life, I can tell you over and over again that God has been so faithful. When I am faithful to make sure I am obeying him in every way that I possibly can, he is faithful to me. And so as long as he knows what the plan is, I will go where he says to go. I will stay where he says to stay, no matter how costly it might be to stay or to go. And so this morning, as the team comes and we worship, and during this time, feel free if you'd like to pray, if you'd like to sit in your seat and pray, if you'd like to go to someone for prayer, or you can stand and sing with us. But I want to take just a moment to reflect on God's faithfulness, that we would take a moment to remember who he is. And as we can see through the story of the line of David, we have a history of God's faithfulness. And not just in the Bible, but there's a history of God's faithfulness in this room. I bet you could turn to a lot of the people around you and you could say, tell me a story of a time where God was faithful to you. And they could tell you maybe a few stories of how God had been faithful to them. And when life feels hard, when things feel uncertain, we have to remind ourselves of who he is. And the more that we turn to him and we look to him and we know who he is, the more he enables us to be able to live out whatever it is he's asking us to do. So this morning, if you'll stand with me, the team will just kind of play a little softly, and maybe just where you are, I want you to think of a time where you just knew God took care of you. You knew he did something for you. Maybe it's a family member. You saw God heal them. You saw God move in their life. And that we would take a moment just to be grateful. That we would be grateful for who he is. That we would be grateful for how far he's brought us. And that we would allow that gratitude and that knowledge of who he is to keep propelling us forward through the season that you're in right now, whatever that might look like. God, we thank you. We thank you for your faithfulness. God, your word says that whether we feel like we are living on empty or whether we feel like we're living on full, that you are with us. That you care and you take care of even the flowers in the fields. And so how much more do you love and care for each of us? God, we want to reflect on your goodness. We want to reflect on your faithfulness, on who you are. God, I thank you for the times where you have been faithful to me, where you have been my healer, you have been my hope, you have been my encouragement. You have provided in ways that were so unexpected, in ways that I didn't deserve. God, would you instill in each of us this morning just a drive and a desire to keep going, to keep doing the things that you're asking us to do, even if they feel hard, even if it's breaking our heart, even if it just is a devastating situation. God, would you help us to just keep going? Would you give us the wisdom to know what to say and what to do? God, would we follow you so closely that it would always be clear to us what you are doing, even if we can't always see the bigger picture? God, inspire us this morning to be someone like Naomi, to be someone who loves other people so well because of our love for you that we change the course of their life. God, we want to be who you say that we are, and we want to love people into a relationship with you. We thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you that you are always who you say you are, that you are always trustworthy and good and true. God, we love you. We thank you for this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.